On this episode of China Unscripted, the Wuhan Institute of Virology is hiding something big. The Chinese Communist Party celebrates 100 years of lies, and why America's elite support the Chinese Communist Party. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesha.
And this podcast is sponsored by Daily Peanut. The news can be a tough pill to swallow, especially the news you're about to hear. But that's why you'll love Daily Peanut, which gives you the news each day in small doses. Part humor, part substance. And joining us today is Jack Posobiec, senior editor of Human Events, and according to your Twitter handle, Communism Disrespecter. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, yeah, thank you. I appreciate you adding that. I changed my Twitter handle and the bio pretty frequently. Sometimes, kind of with like, if there's something going on in current events, I'll add, something like I was test ballots Poso recently to talk about the problems in the New York mayoral primary because they added all these test ballots, of course, that were seeping their way into the actual count. So I was test ballot Poso, there was something else Poso, My Pillow promo code Poso, and all the different things. So Communism Disrespecter, we're trying that one out because, a lot of people were asking me, they say, you're always talking about China, you're always talking about Antifa, you got this wife from the former Soviet Union, satellite republic. You're from Poland originally, your family. So like, how do you tie it all together? And I say, I guess, it's all communism, right? So I'm a communism disrespecter.
But has real communism been tried?
No, never once, actually. As a matter of fact, it's the next one will be the real one.
Something to look forward to then.
Yes, we'll all be looking forward with our red hearts emblazoned as the sun shining above Tiananmen Square Gate.
That came a little too easily.
I know. I've been watching too many of the 100-year anniversary, so I've been drenched in CCP propaganda for the last week or so.
That stuff is so creepy. Like it really is cult-like. Like when they have the hammer and sickle in gold shining down on the people.
And it looks like everyone's worshiping the hammer and sickle flag. Yeah. It's pretty weird.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, the official position of any communist party, right, or any communist country is going to be that we are officially an atheist nation. But when you look at it, it's no, you've replaced your national religion with the religion of Marxist-Leninism, right? So this has become a new national religion that's taught in every school. It's taught from the highest levels of government all the way down so that, everything, yeah, sure, they allow some temples to be open and, some of the like official churches here and there. But when it really comes down to it, what you're looking at is essentially a state religion that's being pressed by the government, which, and it's so interesting because, I try to explain to people in the West that, we don't have anything. They're like, well, they're a political party. No. They're not a political party. CCP is not like, it's not like the Republican Party. And then you have a committee man and you go to a meeting like once a week or something. No, it's not like that at all.
What I find interesting is that it's become so blatant in the lead up to the 100th anniversary stuff. Like Xi Jinping goes to these, holy sites, and that's the word they use for the history of the Communist Party in China. And then he talks about how going to these sites is like a process of spiritual awakening. It's really interesting that they can just use all this language. But in the West, we're kind of like, oh, like we just ignore it. Like we don't really see what they're talking about.
Well, it's in the West, right? We instead of we had been secular for so many years, and now in the West we're getting a new religion called wokeism, and that is really what's being preached and instituted. Though, of course, it's being fought against by like the actual like traditional Western values. But the fact that what Xi Jinping is doing, it's totally different. By the way, from the early communists, Mao was never like this. By blending, right, mysticism and a lot of traditional spiritual beliefs with the CCP, it's actually more dynastic, right? And if I had to compare it to anything, I'd compare it to the dynastic theory of the mandate of heaven that exists in China. And, it's almost like he's tacitly he's saying it without saying it, that the CCP is the new dynasty, and we have been given the mandate of heaven. We are prosperous, we are strong, and this is all because heaven favors us. So you see this as well in their response to COVID-19, where when it first came out, they said this virus is a demon from hell, right? And you certainly would never hear Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin talking like that, using, these guys are technocrats. You wouldn't hear them using spiritual references or theological references. But with Xi Jinping, he's taking that all to another level. And then, of course, he always positions himself as the locus of all of that power and all of that energy. I mean, it really is like he's giving himself the mandate of heaven has been bestowed upon him.
One thing that's interesting about what you're saying about the mandate of heaven, these kinds of things, it almost seems like a result also of co-opting Chinese culture into it, because I think the party has, for many decades now, tried to basically co-opt Chinese culture and say, well, we are the legacy of, 5,000 years of history, all this stuff, and use nationalism and kind of bring that into their type of socialism with Chinese characteristics. So but Chinese language and culture is full of things like mandate of heaven, or when, Xi Jinping is at Tiananmen Square and he's wishing the Communist Party to long life, he uses wan sui, which is the term that you would say, live 10,000 years, which is what you used to say that to the emperors. So there's a lot of this blending of Chinese culture, of kind of the original communism, and Xi Jinping going back to a lot of the type of communism that you saw before reform and opening up, which was always there, but kind of less explicit for people looking at it from the West.
Well, there's also, and I would even say that it's almost like directly against some of the very early Marxist kind of programs that were pushed in the different campaigns, like the Four Olds campaign, for example, right? So this was something that was part of, prior to like the first United Front, even before the Japanese invasion. And then again, you see these forces kind of bubble up again during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, or excuse me, the Great Proletarian Revolution. And, it's this targeting of Chinese culture. So, doing away with traditional characters, stylizing Mandarin as really kind of being pushed across all the provinces, and then shutting down, basically the teaching of local dialects in schools, or the use of local dialects in broadcast television or radio. And then, this idea that we have to destroy history, that we have to sever history. History is a history of imperialism. And this is, of course, straight from Marx, right? This is Marx taking his I guess, as we would say in the Gramscian sense in the West, we would call it his critical lens, right? The critical view of historicity, and saying that history is a struggle between the imperialists and the proletariat. Now, what she is doing, right, and this is where the culture part falls in. Now they've actually reformulated the proposition, and so instead of history being the proletariat versus the imperialists and the ruling class, now history is the Chinese people versus the outside world. And that's the only thing that's ever been going on. And that, of course, is the theme that you hear again and again and again. And of course, this is where you get most infamously or famously, it's what the 100 years of humiliation, right? The century of humiliation, which they talk about, the Opium War to the founding of the People's Republic. Which I always find very interesting, because I always kind of point out, they say, well, World War II, where was the CCP? And you guys were out in Yan'an. You were on the Long March, right? You were out in the provinces. It was not the CCP fighting the Japanese by and large, or any of the major skirmishes, right? That was Kuomintang. That was Chiang Kai-shek, right? That was the nationalists. That was the Americans with the Flying Tigers, right? CCP was waiting and holding much of their strength in reserve so that after the war, they could then come back and take over. Keep in mind as well that the CCP, by and large, up until, I guess, the 1960s, was essentially a foreign-backed insurrectionist movement, right? This was a Soviet program under their Far East Bureau. You had Soviet agents at that founding of the CCP in Shanghai in the 1920s, in that sort of garden mansion that's still there in Xintiandi in the French concession. It gets broken up by French police later on. And so this, the way that they're looking at it is, oh no, we're the representatives of the Chinese people. No, you guys were backed by the Russians early on. You were foreign backed the same way that the Japanese were foreign backed. It was the nationalists that were actually the representatives of the people, founded by Sun Yat-sen, And you were the ones who used foreign power, foreign money, foreign influence, foreign material to grow and become stronger. And then were able to take over the country after the war because you declared war on the, in the immediate aftermath of the United Front, the defeat of Japan. But of course, none of that gets taught, right? None of that gets questioned in the history books. It's all the CCP defeated Japan. They pushed them out. They defeated the imperialists, and now they are the ones making China strong again. Which you talk about Deng Xiaoping and reform and opening up. The financing for reform and open up, the financing for the beginning of China, or beginning of new China, I guess you could say, that's not coming from anywhere internal. That's FDI. That's foreign direct investment. So again, that's foreign countries who decided, or really, I would say foreign financiers who have decided that there's so much opportunity for growth in China that they are the ones who come in and start bankrolling so many of these new operations. And you get like quasi-privatization, you get these state-owned or state partnership JVEs, the joint ventures that are going on in China. So, it's very interesting that, of course, that the way they present things is completely divorced from what's actually going on under the hood.
Yeah, the reality is a group of Soviet-backed communist guerrilla forces seized control of West Taiwan. But yeah, but
right, exactly.
We're talking about
West Taiwan and Tibet and East Turkestan and
that's right,
Manchuria, Inner Mongolia,
all the places. I mean, it's interesting when you talked about the way that they talk about the World War II, because often in history books it'll be a very passive sentence that's like the Japanese were defeated in 1945.
It's technically not a lie.
That's technically not a lie. And it makes it seem like, well, we defeated the Japanese, but the Japanese were defeated.
They were defeated
by someone in 1945. But what you were just talking about, Jack, was very similar to what we started talking about, the religion thing, about how they essentially hollowed out religion in China and then replaced it with the Communist Party. And then they've kind of taken history, like the Chinese cultural history, and kind of taken that and twisted it to become, the history of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, that's a point I wanted to make. Like we were talking about how, like, you made the point that, like, the Cultural Revolution, the campaign against the Four Olds, that seems like it's in conflict with what's happening right now. But the reality is, communist revolutions have always used whatever tactics they can to achieve whatever their aims may be at the time. And the reality is the campaign against the Four Olds is not in conflict with the current use of Chinese culture and history by Xi Jinping. It's very much tied together because when you destroy the intellectuals, when you destroy people's understanding of history, then it can be whatever you want it to be. And you see Xi Jinping using it.
They can rewrite Genesis in their own Bible, right? So now it's essentially like all created by them, right? Like the modern
Did they
China.
rewrite Genesis?
Well, no, but I mean, like in their own sort of communist way of looking at things, right? Like they're rewriting the history of how the PRC was established, right? Like basically, as you pointed out, Jack, hiding all the things that they, all the battles they intentionally missed in World War II so that the Kuomintang could get, their soldiers and leadership killed.
Yeah. I couldn't imagine living in a country that is dramatically rewriting its own history.
Right. And it's interesting. And you hear like Yeonmi Park when she was speaking out recently, talking about coming from one of those countries. And I had the opportunity to speak to another North Korean defector. And the one thing that he said that always stuck out for me was that, we know what they're teaching us about the rest of the world isn't true. But at the same time, because we don't have any other access to information, we don't know what true is, right? So we know that history isn't this caricature necessarily. And we know that the rest of the world, the United States is not some kind of like, what do they say? They always play up like racial disparity in the United States. They always play up the violence. It's not like a shooting gallery. Like clearly it's a very strong country. It's a very successful country. So it can't be the way that they're talking about. But we don't really know what it's like. They didn't even know what South Korea was like, right? Because they can't peer over the horizon on their own, right? They have to see everything through that lens. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think that, when I just having the years I spent in China, it seemed to me that as people got older, they kind of started to have that realization. But at the same time, because, they're like anybody else, they've got families, they got jobs, they've got kids. So they're like, well, yeah, we know the system is the way it is, but what are we going to do about it? Right. We just want what's best for our family.
I think this is a big failing of sort of America's response to the Chinese Communist Party, that it's often viewed from the lens of competing nations rather than a fundamental ideological struggle.
Yeah. So, I mean, the United States for so many years had operated under this fallacy, right? That the fall of the Soviet Union came about because liberal democracy was better, and that the U.S. version of this sort of secular, capitalistic, free market enterprise system was the best. And the system of international liberalism through these programs like the United Nations and the WHO, et cetera, were going to work. And so it was almost like buying into. So in Marxism, there's that idea of kind of the historical cycle, right? This is the way that history is moving, and it'll eventually turn to socialism, and then socially eventually turns into stateless communism, right? And so it's almost like in the West that people had, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had told themselves, well, this is the way of the world, right? This is universal, that these beliefs, these precepts are universal. And this is where you get in the late 90s, early 2000s, and specifically the response to 9/11, you get nation building, right? And then so they embark upon these nation building exercises in the Middle East. And they say, well, I mean, everybody wants to be democratic and have parties and have multi-party voting. And that's what we're going to do. And we're going to have these civil rights. And it's very Lockean. And it's all going back to all of these things and trying to pose that on cultures that have never had anything like that, even started, right? have no cultural norms or even cultural ties whatsoever. We're talking about the Middle East. And then so you have those same people deluding themselves into thinking that if we just, the response to Tiananmen Square was to increase trade ties with the PRC. Think about that, right? In what other situation would that ever be the response, right? Because they're looking at it as, well, if we just expose them to more of our system, then they'll become more like us.
Yeah, if I murdered a bunch of people, no one would be like, hey, we should give that guy more money. That'll stop him in the future.
Yeah, let's just fund them more, right? No, you would say, hey, cut those guys off. We need to do something about this. This is a problem. We would never approached the Russian Communist Party like this. We've never approached the Soviet Union like this after one of their massacres. And so when it comes to that situation, you can actually see things changing in a different lens where instead, and this is something that I actually have an op-ed that's coming out pretty soon, and I don't necessarily, I'm trying to make a big plug for it, but it's going to be up at Human Events later this weekend, where I talk about how if you look at the numbers of it, right? So the CCP is about 92 million members for 1.4 billion of the population of China. And so it's like 1%, but it's actually like 0.6%, it's less than 1%. But thinking of it in terms of the 1% is actually very useful for us, because they have their 1%, and in the United States and the greater West, of course, we have our 1% as well, right? Call them the ruling class, the elites, the oligarchs in many cases, right? When you talk about finance or Silicon Valley. And so when you look at this connection between their 1%, the CCP, and our 1%, which side has influenced the other, right?
Great point.
Our 1% have not become their 1% have not become more open-minded and liberal and allowing for democracy and civil rights. No, our 1% have become more authoritarian, more forceful, more demanding. And you can see this, by the way. It's so amazing. So Charlie Munger of Berkshire Hathaway, this, 97 years old, he's kind of known as the brains behind the operation there at Berkshire. Warren Buffett, of course, the Oracle of Omaha and everything. But really, Charlie Munger, he's very, very revered for people on Wall Street. And I wrote this whole op-ed before he goes and gives this interview with CNBC. And he says he's praising the CCP in their treatment of Jack Ma, the way they shut him down, the way they disappeared him, right? He said, I wish that we had, well, he catches himself. I wish we had that, well, not their whole system, but certainly the financial system of China. I wish we had here in the United States, and why the government should just be able to shut down people they don't like and stop people they don't like. And what was Jack Ma doing? He was trying to get the average Laobaixing Chinese person more involved in banking and spread banking and a lot of these financial tools out throughout the general population in China. That's what they shut down because they didn't want that amount of financial and economic freedom being spread throughout the country. And so who do we have in the United States proposing this and promoting it and praising it? It's Charlie Munger, one of the richest people in the United States, clearly someone, a titan, absolute titan of Wall Street. The closest thing you could have to a Western oligarch saying, oh my gosh, I love this system. Why can't we do that here in the United States? Right. So that's when I talk about this marriage between their 1% and our 1%. It's been a marriage that's influenced the West. It hasn't influenced them.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Charlie Munger. You've got people like Michael Bloomberg, who praised the way that the Chinese regime did their massive and very brutal lockdowns during COVID.
Yep.
You've got people like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, who's, adopting these kind of, I guess you'd call them censorship strategies, asking people to potentially, let them know if there's people who might be extremists.
Yeah, that's just in the last 2 days.
And can I just say how brave it is of you to be saying this in Tiananmen Square?
Well, I actually do have I've never posted it, but I have a photo of myself in Tiananmen Square from, I want to say it's 2008. And it's midnight from June 3rd going into June 4th. So it's just turned June 4th. So it's the night of the anniversary. And I'm standing there pretty close to the front, and it's just me flipping off Chairman Mao and his giant portrait over the Tiananmen Gate. And I gotta find it. It's like one of my favorite pictures, though.
Well, speaking of that, I think a lot of people watching might be more familiar with you as sort of a American political commentator and don't know about how much you know about China. So for people watching, why don't you give a quick rundown of how you know China?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, right? That behind the scenes, I've been a China guy for going back almost 15 years now. To my first visit in China was 2006. So yeah, that's 15 years.
Impossible. 2008 wasn't 15 years ago.
2006 was 15 years ago.
2006. Yeah.
No, that was like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, it's
right?
not that long. It can't
I
be.
know, right? Tell me about it. So it's, yeah, when you want to really start feeling old, think about how long ago 1980 was. Yeah, pretty fun, right? We're as far now from the 80s as the 90s were from the 1950s. So boom, have fun with that. So in 2006, I did my first trip to China, was so interested in it, had the opportunity to go as an undergrad, decided I wanted to do a study abroad there, ended up doing the study abroad for my last semester of college, and then had an internship for the American Chamber of Commerce. And then one of our sort of clients at the chamber there in Shanghai had said, hey, what are you doing after graduation? I said, I don't know. I was going to travel. I was going to do whatever. And they said, well, do you want a job? I said, sure, I'll have a job. So I ended up working for an American consulting firm there in Shanghai, right on Nanjing Lu, and had the opportunity to travel all over China doing business with, kind of as a representative of American business and American firms there literally throughout the country. And then even on my own, had the opportunity to travel to Tibet, to Xinjiang. When I got back, I decided that I wanted to, people said, look, do you want to stay working in U.S. China business? You can make a lot of money doing this consulting work. I learned the language while I was there. So I was doing intensive language courses and got really into the history, not only of the CCP, but of the country itself, and especially the city of Shanghai. And I said, no, I wanted to try to do something from an American sense, right? And I don't think that business is the right way to do it. Because I was worried about the CCP and I was worried about the rise of their power, not only in Asia, but also throughout the world. And I viewed it as a threat to the United States. And so I joined the United States military, picked the Navy because I knew the Navy had the most international focus. They had the most focus on China, and then ended up serving for about 8 years, first as an intelligence analyst, then later as an intelligence officer. I was a Mandarin linguist while I was in, so did multiple deployments to East Asia as part of that, working on different task forces, working on different planning groups for different things within what was at the time was called PACOM, Pacific Command. Now it's called Indo-PACOM, so the Indo-Pacific Command. So they wanted to kind of add India into that because technically India isn't in the Pacific, right? It's the Indian Ocean, not Pacific Ocean. And really just learned a lot, learned so much about it. And then, 2016 rolls around, and that's really when my public profile started taking off within the United States in terms of just domestic politics. But I really viewed so many of the forces and the pressures of domestic American politics, tied into this idea of whether the United States was in international decline and domestic decline. I would argue both. And that led to the outcome of 2016. And so much of that, right, is being in part driven by China. It's being driven by the American 1%, by the Western 1%, and is being taken advantage of by the CCP in terms of this relationship, which goes back to, the outsourcing that I viewed while I was there, the outsourcing and the manufacturing that was going on. So much of these factories, so many of these investments are all going into China. And when you look at it, and the business owners there and the representatives of these companies, the vice presidents, the people who get sent over as, hey, you're going to be our China office manager, you're going to be our China VP, our Shanghai VP, our Guangzhou VP, whichever it is, it's all a cost benefit to the company kind of situation. But it didn't seem like anybody was paying attention to the effect it was having on international relations or paying attention to the effect it was having on the United States of shipping that bulk of the American backbone of manufacturing to China and shipping that all of those jobs to China and to away from, the United States, particularly the Midwest and in the Northeast, where I'm from the Philadelphia area originally. And so, learning about all that and seeing it, I said, wow, this just doesn't seem, it never sat right with me. Something seemed wrong about it. So, it's very interesting to me that when we think about all of these issues that we're talking about today on a regular basis, on that these are commonplace issues. This is what I was thinking about, 12 years ago, 11 years ago, 10 years ago, and wanting to do something about.
Now, when you were in China in the late 2000s, working with the different businesses and traveling around, what made you realize that the Chinese Communist Party was a threat? I mean, because you were working with businesses that wanted to work with the Chinese Communist Party, right?
Right. So if you're, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people in the United States understand, at least writ large, that if you're doing business in China, right, you have to deal with the CCP. There's no way around it, right? Every company has party members in it. Every deal maker has to get blessed off by the CCP at some point. There has to be, whether it's provincial, whether it's regional, whether it's national, you all need the blessing. You need someone, right? You need someone with guanxi, right? You need someone with, and that's it's so hard for a lot of Westerners to understand the concept of guanxi, which it doesn't just mean you're well connected, right? You need to have good guanxi as well, right? You need to have like a positive. So it's like your reputation and your connections and your power and your influence all combined. And of course, that's going to come up with party connections. That's all part of increasing it. This is the way that CCP has kind of injected themselves as the locus of success in China, right? So yes, they have these sort of market forces, but the only pathways to achieving that final success or achieving your degree of, rising yourself up, or if you have a company you're building, whatever it is you're doing, or in the military, if you're scientist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right? You have to go through the party process at some point, and that when someone's kind of like on their way up, as a rising star, someone from the party will reach out to you, or you'll be asked to go to a meeting, and then you're offered membership, and there's this huge process to get in, and it's seen as an honorific, right? It's seen as you are now part of the 1%, right? That's the way to look at the CCP, right? That's your right of entry. And that's if you don't have like a family background or one of these other sort of like endemic pathways in. And so coming from my background, just, I'm Polish, born in the US, my family's Polish. So, I've always had a very, very dark view of communism, but in many ways, a very clear view of communism, and knowing what it did to Poland and what it did to Eastern Europe, and understanding that this is a problem and a force that should not be trifled with. And they have a completely different set of values than we would in the West. They don't believe in civil rights. They don't believe in human rights. They don't believe in the value of human life. They don't believe in the same set of morals that, individual morality as we would in the West. And so when you start asking those types of questions, I'll give you an example, actually. I'll give you a good example. This is a story I tell sometimes. So we had in Shanghai, they call it the Shanghai Planning Museum, right? And what's the Shanghai Planning Museum? Well, the Shanghai Planning Museum is the municipal, it's almost like a part think tank, part nerve center, part party apparatus building. It's right down from the Shanghai Museum, where when you go there, and it's not open to the public, right? You have to be invited in. That is where the city planners of Shanghai decide what they are going to do with the city next. They decide what deals are going to happen, what infrastructure is going to be built, what new, if the Shanghai World Expo was coming in. So any big exhibits or events that are going on, it all runs through there. So we would bring over U.S. politicians sometimes, and whether it be senators, congressmen on a congressional delegation, or whether it be just their staff, or a lot of state officials, so state governors would come by, and we would always take them through this place, the Shanghai Planning Center. And as they would go through, they'd look at all these amazing, expansive mega projects, right? And of course, China's known for its mega projects, right? Three Gorges Dam is like the biggest one that they're well known for. But they would say, "Wow, look at these! Look at what you can do, and you can just move this, and you set this up, and man, now you got maglevs here, and you've got this nuclear plant. And you just set this up, and you set all of these different things up, and boom, and it happens, and it's incredible, and it's intoxicating to them. And it was like they were getting drunk on the amount of power that they realized the CCP had, because you don't have to worry about zoning restrictions or eminent domain. There's no eminent domain. The party owns everything, right? You don't have to worry about getting funding from the bank. If this thing's approved, then boom, you've got all the funding you need. You don't need to worry about environmental considerations. You don't need to worry about, and if people are living in the area, well, get rid of them, right? They don't want the maglev there. Well, then they're not going to be there anymore. Oh, these are historic Shurkuman buildings, right? These old, very culturally significant living quarters that people have lived in Shanghai for hundreds of years. Knock them down, get them out of the way. We need progress, right? And Michael Bloomberg is a great example of that, right? Because he's sort of one of the most prominent members of what I would call the technocratic, Acela corridor class in the United States, where it is intoxicating to them when they look at that system and they say, look, it's all top down. We don't need to worry about these annoyances anymore. We don't need to worry about these little people and their little problems. We have big ideas, big innovation, big plans. And with this model, and this is what Charlie Munger is talking about, right? I know exactly what Charlie Munger is talking about when he says that. That's the model that he wants, because he wishes, they all wish, that they could have that much power in the United States, in the West, to get done whatever it is that their scope of their dreams is. And so when I started reflecting back on realizing that this is the situation that's going on, that this is they want the Chinese model. They want the CCP model. They're not coming over and talking about how great it is to have democracy and civil rights. You never even have that discussion, right? So I would see them come through and they're getting introduced to it. They're getting a taste of it. And so when Elon Musk, great example of this, Elon Musk tweets just a few nights ago as Xi Jinping is giving his, saber rattling speech there in the Mao garb at the Tiananmen Gate, that Elon Musk says, wow, if people could just visit China and see what they're doing, particularly in terms of infrastructure, well, they would have their eyes opened the same way I did. I'm like, Elon, I bet I know exactly how you got your eyes opened when you were in Shanghai, when you were in China. It's the exact same thing. It's
basically like a twisted version of SimCity.
It is kind of like SimCity. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And it's like, whoever played a game of SimCity that it didn't end in some disaster or another, right?
Yeah, but the same idea. You don't have to worry about the Sims, like if you tear down a building or put a nuclear power plant somewhere.
That's why I love SimCity. The power was intoxicating. I just destroyed everything and it was fine. I could rebuild in my own image. Beautiful.
Right. I had Poso City, and then here's the Poso Castle, Poso Palace. All right, we're going to put that there, this here. Now, what about the people who live on Main Street? I don't like Main Street anymore. Get rid of it. Make it gone. Now it's Poso Place, right? It's like SimCity. It's exactly like SimCity, actually.
Wow, I can't wait to have that glorious system here in the U.S. Imagine a world where you don't own anything.
The thing is, when we get that system in the U.S., we aren't going to be the ones at the keyboard and the controls, right? People like Charlie Munger, people like Elon Musk, they're going to be Michael Bloomberg, Pete Buttigieg. I love Pete Buttigieg, right? You're going to be the Secretary of Transportation, right? Well, what do you know about that? You're the mayor of some town in Indiana. What do you know about transportation? I've always been a fan of transportation. And it doesn't matter, right? He is a man of the new system. He is a technocrat. That is exactly the type of person we are talking about, where they are not in it. They're not in it for and then of course wokeness, and not to get too off topic on that, but wokeness gives them this amazing example of kind of deflecting from talking about anything they're doing. Let's not talk about where Elon Musk is getting his cobalt, right, from the blood mines of Africa and VW, and where all the materials that they're sourcing are, and how they're getting it from the strip mining in Africa for these electric cars. No. It's wokeness, right? Wait. What about those child minds that you guys are using? Excuse me, is that your white privilege talking? And then they can just deflect right away from it, and they can say you're part of the problem, that you need to get with the solution. And they have this ready made for them where they can talk about, and it's Pride Month, and they can all put up the flag and talk about that all day long to completely distract you from what's actually going on behind the scenes.
And meanwhile, companies like Nike is lobbying, or Apple lobbying against Uyghur slave labor bills.
Right.
Because it's part of their supply chain, and they don't.
Well, and Disney is thanking them. Disney, thank you so much to the Xinjiang Party Committee for allowing us to shoot the film Mulan here in, just what is it, miles away from the concentration camps. But fortunately, we were able to set it up in such a way that we angled our cameras so that you wouldn't be able to see the million people who are locked up.
Well, so I think this is an important point. I think you and I sort of have a lot of similarities in that, like, we saw years ago the really negative influence the Chinese Communist Party was having on the United States. But a lot of people didn't see that. But now with the coronavirus, things have changed a little bit. And I want to talk about a story you guys just covered on human events, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting experiments on transgenic mice, which is a way of saying human-animal chimeras, trying to get bat coronaviruses to be more infectious to humans. And they were doing this in 2019. Do you think they were successful?
Well, so here's the thing, right, is that there's a variety of experiments. And we've been digging into the Wuhan Institute of Virology very closely. We've been looking at this. And, I'm not one of those guys who is like, oh, Dr. Fauci, I don't listen to anything he says. I know I listen to everything he says. And I listen very, very closely to the things he says. And I remember those early task force meetings where we were told very specifically at those briefings that this thing, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is the official name for it. We all called it Wuhan coronavirus, by the way, at the beginning.
Even in Chinese state-run media.
Yeah, that everyone was calling it that, right? And he said the reason that it was so there was the R naught number, right? The reason that it was so infectious, that it spread so quickly, was that it had a spike protein that fit almost perfectly with the human ACE2 receptors, which are found in human lungs. And I said, wow, that's okay. That's very interesting. So this spike protein fits directly in humans. Got it. Understood. Wrote it down. Mental note. Then when you look at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and you start looking at these programs that they were doing and this research they were running, some of it, of course, we not later found out was funded by the NIH, but not all of it, through these, EcoHealth and Peter Daszak and all these sort of front companies that they run. And you find that they were humanizing the mice to have these ACE2 receptors in their lungs, because they found that when they, and this is even prior to 2019, this is going back to 2015. You even see some of this experimentation going on all as far back as 2007, right? And these are the gain of function, right? These are gain of function experiments that they said, well, it wasn't working out because mice lungs don't have the same ACE2 receptors as humans. So what do we need to do? We need to humanize the mice, right? So they come up with this process of humanizing the mice to give them these ACE2 receptors. Then they're going through like a roulette wheel of these different coronaviruses that they all glean from this cave outside of Kunming in Yunnan province, which is about 1,000 miles away from Wuhan, for people who don't know the geography. That's all the way down by the Vietnamese-Laos border. That's practically Southwest Asia. This we're now talking about Southeast Asia. This now is, Wuhan is like kind of like Central Eastern in terms of China. It is interior, but you see the very same phrases all over again. Spike proteins of the coronaviruses are now fitting because we've humanized the mice to have the ACE2 receptors. And so to me, this, just looking at it as someone who, I don't have a biology background, but I have an investigation background. And I say, well, what's going on with that? So you call up the experts and you call up epidemiologists. And I've spoken to microbiologists and toxicologists about this as well. And they said, a lot of the things that we're looking at definitely seem to be, these are clearly mutated viruses that have come out here in these cases. These are instances where we're definitely talking about gain of function experiments. And I said, just look, is it possible that this could have led to the initial creation of SARS-CoV-2? I'm not saying did it, right? I'm not saying that's 100% what happened, but just looking at the data here, can you, somebody who has the background in this, and they said, yeah, it could. But what we would need is the actual data. The actual data on this stuff, it's scrubbed. You can't find it. The NIH database, where they had initially put up some of the genomic sequences for the early patients of COVID-19 from Wuhan, at least the ones that they had publicly acknowledged, China pulled them back out of the NIH database, and the NIH let them be under this international agreement that they had. So going back to the sort of the marriage of the 1% with the CCP. So there's an international agreement that if they can just ask for their data back, we'll delete it, give them their data back, and say, hey, no harm, no foul, no copies of it as far as we know. And the NIH won't even tell us. They won't even tell us who specifically requested it back. I'm pretty sure I know who did, but or at least have a list, a pretty short list of who it was. They won't even tell us who made the request unless we file a Freedom of Information Act with the NIH, right? So our own government won't tell us who in China it was that took out this data, because they're worried that we might find out what was actually going on. So you look at who's protecting who in these situations, and they realize that they have a problem. And you can see this in so many of those emails from Dr. Fauci that came out, where he's asking these very same questions that I was asking, just in terms of a guy who has the investigation background. I was a Navy intelligence officer, looking into this, following the trail where it leads to the Wuhan Institute, right? And even to a story that we did, and we have this by way of WikiLeaks, where there was a cable that came out from the desk of Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, rightfully, by the way, saying she's about to have a meeting with the French and it's on bioweapons. And she said, this is all the way back in 2009, but she says, hey, I hear France is about to start working with China to start setting up a BSL-4 laboratory in Wuhan. That is something that we know that bioweapons could come out of those facilities. And we'd like to know, are you sure that you've given them full procedures for containment? Do you have a way of surveillance? What are the different methods that are being used there to ensure the safety of this thing? So you've even got the State Department under Hillary Clinton all the way back in 2009 asking the very same question about what exactly is being created in that lab.
What I find so fascinating about the story is that it's like we just believed everything that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was saying, that Shi Jinli was saying. It was like, she did, Scientific American did that kind of puff piece with her last year, and they were just like, there's that part where she was like, oh, well, I was worried it could have come from my lab. And then I searched all my records and I was so relieved it didn't come from my lab. And then they were kind of just like, well, okay, then,
Well, have you seen her latest? I think it's with, she did an interview with NBC. So, okay, just last week, and I keep meaning, I just haven't personally had time to do this. I keep meaning to clip this and put this out. So she does an interview where NBC goes back and they get some kind of access. And she does this interview with them and she goes, well, there's a lot of myths that are being spread on the internet about my work. And they say that we were up to no good and blah, blah, blah. She actually says that. She says, blah, 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 but really, we're not doing anything like that. So they can take all their blah, blah, blah. And, she just kind of downplays it like that. So it's even she is going back and becoming a little bit more hardline on this, where you're right, in that initial interview, which I wish she probably wishes that she didn't give, where she said, yeah, I went back and was checking the records. I was so worried. Now she's saying, oh, that's just a bunch of internet talk. That's a bunch of blah, blah, blah. No, it's not a bunch of blah, blah, blah. And if it were, you wouldn't have a problem showing us the data. And this study, which we mentioned, but we didn't get into, that we've discovered was listed, that was supposed to have started in 2019, January of 2019. There was a study up by a researcher named Hu Bun. And what we found is we couldn't even find any information about the study. We only found the funding approval for it that came down a year prior in 2018. So we found this document on an archive site from the Chinese Medical Journal of Science that said, we are going to be conducting this experiment with transgenic mice, the pathogenicity of 2 new bat coronaviruses that was supposed to start in January of 2019. That's on the archive site, and it was supposed to run all the way through December of 2021. You try to find any information about that study, any information about this guy Hu Bun, or what was going on from it, it's wiped. It is wiped clean. It is scrubbed. The Wuhan Institute has taken it down. You ask them about it, they won't talk to you about it. And now that Peter Daszak has rightfully been called out on his lies and his cover-ups in conjunction with the Lancet and everything else, I think people know that story by now. They're now rolling out this new doctor, this Australian doctor, Dr. Danielle Anderson, and she's coming out saying, well, I worked in the lab and it was very safe, and I didn't even see anybody who is sick. Well, okay, it's a big lab, Danielle. We know there's a lot of people there. We know that. And again, in many of these instances, you probably weren't privy to everything that was going on there, because we know there were ties to the PLA. We know there was classified information, classified experiments that were going on there. And so that is why we are going to keep digging. So the bottom line is, if Shi Jinli, if you don't have any worry about what was going on there, then show us the data, right? Show us the data so we can move on and go back to looking at bats, or go back to looking for this intermittent species, whatever it might be, maybe a pangolin, maybe it's a civet like the original SARS. We don't know. But the fact that they won't let you have any access to the data, and the fact that they're scrubbing all of this information, they're taking down information about these studies, especially the one that started in January of 2019 that Human Events has reported on, those are the questions that get people wondering what's really going on there.
I think it might just be because there's nothing questionable in the data that shows anything bad that they were doing. So why should we in the West waste our time going through it? And that makes sense why they would have scrubbed it, right? It's just to help us not waste our time.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they just scrubbed us because they don't want us worrying about it. They want to put us at ease. They just I'm alive, 没关系. You have so many other things to be worried about. And and also from a higher level, I just like to say thank you to Xi Jinping for providing us with so many access points to this information about the pandemic when it came out, certainly letting us know as soon as there was a problem, he let the world know. And of course, he shut down the international travel from China because, oh, wait, no, that's not what happened, is it? No, in fact, they shut down domestic travel, but they allowed international travel to continue. And in fact, we're starting to get indications that they may have known there was a problem as far back as October of 2019 when they held the World Military Games in Wuhan, where you had Western, Canadian, American military athletes that were traveling to Wuhan to participate in these. It's kind of like a mini Olympics for the military that was going on. And you look back at some of those pictures and you're talking now to some of the athletes that were coming back from that. And they're saying, yeah, we all had respiratory infections. In fact, I haven't run this completely to ground yet, but I actually had, what's the best way to put this? So I had a couple of sources reach out to Human Events recently who were on a tour. They were on, those riverboat tours they do in China. They're just American tourists who happened to be in Wuhan in October of 2019 who had come back. And they said, look, we are convinced. We all were sick. Every single one of us came back sick on this trip, and we are convinced that this is what this was, either COVID-19 or one of the early variants of this thing, because we had all the symptoms. We were specifically in Wuhan. And they said that when they were in Wuhan in 2019, October, this is very interesting to me. They said it was like a ghost town all the way back in October. So it's almost like sort of like quasi lockdowns had already begun in October before they'd even alerted the world about it.
It's interesting that you're talking about October, because one of the things that Xi Jinping, they had lied about was they claimed that they took down a database at the Wuhan Institute of Virology after the pandemic had started because they were getting harassed by people who were looking into whether it was a lab leak. And they were like, we took this down, in March or whatever. And it turned out that they actually took that database down in September of 2019.
Right.
Interesting timeline that's coming out.
Right. And so that's another just a very key, something you learn in the intel community, that when you're digging through one of these things, that people, there's so many different avenues and so many different methods of, they say, go down this rabbit hole, go down that rabbit hole. And you can always be doing that. But laying everything out on a timeline is critical to understanding, because again, right, to your point, right, if they took down that database in September of 19, and presumably, right, this study that we're talking about the transgenic mice and the pathogenicity of the two bat coronaviruses would have been included in that database if it was something that they were putting raw data into. So, maybe they've got international partners that are looking at this and trying to, just follow the study as it's going along. Why take that down so early on?
So you mentioned timelines being important. So let me get this straight. I want to kind of lay it out as I understand it from you. In 2018, the Wuhan Institute of Virology got funding to do gain-of-function research on transgenic mice to infect these sort of humanized lung cells with bat coronaviruses to try to adapt those spike proteins to these humanized lungs. And that experimentation started in 2019 in January.
Well, we know from the document that we've seen that it was scheduled to start in 19. And I want to be clear about this. This is not the earlier experiments that were being funded by the NIH. This was wholly funded as far as we can tell from the Chinese Academy of Science. So this is obviously it's building off of those previous experiments, but this was not one of the ones, right, that was being tied into EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak and Fauci and all of these other things. This was a solely done venture from China.
And is the Chinese Academy of Sciences, are they connected to the People's Liberation Army?
Well, I mean, to an extent, everything in China is connected. That's why I always kind of laugh when they say, "Oh, this lab might have ties to this party or this military." So it's all connected, right? So yes, though on paper we do see a strong connection with the Chinese Academy of Science and many questions about China's PLA bioweapons program, right? You're seeing them work hand in hand on multiple programs in terms of this. We've seen it in the past, and intelligence, in the best assessments that we've seen, we've also considered that to be the way they run those programs, right? You're running, and it's the same way that classified programs are run in the United States, by the way, that you're not creating a wholly separate military entity for these things, right? You're working hand in hand with them. You're bringing the expertise of the scientists over. You're giving them, a security clearance, and then you're setting it all up. So it might be, for example, a certain wing of the Wuhan Institute, or a certain room, or even just certain studies that are going on that nobody else in the facility knows about if they don't have clearance, or if they don't have the read-in, need to know, I guess you would say, for that specific program.
Okay. So just to get the timeline straight here. So in 2018, funding was approved to do this kind of research on bat coronaviruses. Supposedly it was scheduled to begin in early 2019. September of 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology took a bunch of related data off of their database. October 2019, a bunch of foreigners traveling in China got sick with mysterious respiratory disease. December 2019, we started to see these cases being reported by whistleblowing doctors in China. Then, like mid-January 2020, after many, many weeks of this mysterious virus going around China, the Chinese Communist Party acknowledges that it's there. First says there's no human-to-human transmission, then later acknowledges, okay, well, maybe there is human-to-human transmission. Meanwhile, they're allowing Chinese people to travel abroad from Wuhan to other countries with basically no exit restrictions. And then basically by February and March, a whole bunch of Western countries are getting infected on a massive scale. Is that basically what we're seeing?
100%. And you remember, and if you look back, by the way, so I'm talking about what's going on in Wuhan and saying we need to shut this down, we need to shut this down. And then, so they do it. I think the 25th is when, because Trump is still president then, so Trump does it. You have a huge response, by the way, from the Chinese diplomatic corps, denying it, opposing it. How dare you? Don't do this. You also have, by the way, where in the country of Italy, where Italy, we know, got hit very hard with this thing early on. And they were going very strongly on Italy, even as Italy was already experiencing these massive first waves of this thing. And I think, quite frankly, I really don't think that you see Western governments, with the exception of Trump's order back in January, you really don't see Western governments getting on board with the severity of this thing until Italy hits, right? So Italy goes bad, and that's when you start seeing these, really strong reactions from U.S. governments and European governments talking about, and that's where you start seeing the mask mandates. That's when lockdowns, of course, are initiated, very, very draconian lockdowns very early on. It's Italy was that flashpoint, I believe. Now,
you bring up the draconian lockdowns. The kind of lockdowns that happened in Italy and in the United States over the past, year, almost year and a half now, they're unprecedented, right? America, even during the 1918 flu pandemic, America never had this kind of lockdown, right? We didn't have it during the 60s when there was a very bad and deadly flu. To what do you attribute this sort of fundamental shift in policy for how to handle a deadly pandemic in terms of implementing these big lockdowns?
Well, I think that's pretty clear, and Majid Nawaz has written about this quite extensively. That this at in the UK, that they were copying what China was doing. They said, well, it looks like China's locking down people, so let's just do the exact same thing. Whatever the CCP prescribes is what we're going to do, right? There's no right, and early on, right. I'm not one of those people who says, that I think that they wanted that this was like a plan or something like that. No, what I think it is going back to what we were saying earlier about the intoxicating influence of that amount of authoritarian power that the CCP wields, and seeing that they also saw that because of the health crisis, this gave them the opportunity to really flex those authoritarian muscles. So they said, just do it. Just do whatever the CCP is doing, whatever they're doing in Wuhan, just do it. Now, of course, I don't think there's anywhere in the West where you saw lockdowns that were quite as bad as what the CCP was doing in terms of locking people into their homes and bolting them down. But you certainly see the severity of these lockdowns. And in many cases, even once we started learning more about how this virus works and started learning more about the actual data of how people are infected and who it hits harder and the different effects that it has, that you start learning about more of the efficacy of lockdowns. And there's still people in the West who will cling to saying, nope, everybody has to lock down. That's the only way. We shouldn't just focus on sick people. We shouldn't just focus on, the elderly or people who have pre-existing conditions, immunocompromised or immunodeficient people. No, it's everyone has to be locked down. That's the only way to be safe.
The New York Times was really pushing that message. China had it right.
Right. And so we're told again and again that this is the way to do things, to follow the CCP model. They got it right. We got it wrong. We need to do whatever they did. And that's what we're told.
Even though the CCP clearly is not super transparent about anything.
Yeah, the question, and I think really the jury is still out on what exactly happened in Wuhan, not only with the initial outbreak of the virus, but also in terms of the response, in terms of, it seems very clear, by the way, that China had some type of treatment for this thing far earlier than they were letting on to the rest of the world. And I think that's definitely something that needs to be investigated and something that needs to be studied very, very clearly, because the rest of the world was conducting lockdowns. We were keeping people separate, et cetera, et cetera. And yet Wuhan specifically seems to be able to go back to their normal levels of work and their normal levels of activity far earlier than other countries. And so the question is either, number one, did they have a treatment early on? And I suspect they did. And then number two, did they also realize that lockdowns weren't necessarily what they needed in terms of this? They just needed to focus on specific people who were sick early on.
Well, there's a lot of questions that have come out from this. One I want to bring up is people were encouraged to go to Wuhan and were getting sick in, what do we say, September, October 2019. We know for a fact that even as it was beginning to spread around the world, China was still allowing international travel from Wuhan.
Not just allowing, demanding.
What do you mean by demanding?
Well, that's what I'm talking about with this, their diplomatic efforts, right? So this huge diplomatic pushback whenever the U.S. and Italy are talking about shutting down travel.
Demanding not to stop it, in a way.
Right, demanding not to stop it. They're demanding you will accept Chinese aircraft.
So what was going on?
So, and this is very much just my assessment kind of mode, but the way I look at things and look at high-level Politburo kind of strategic thinking on this is it really seems like the Politburo took a look at this situation when they finally found out what was happening, when they realized they weren't able to cover up what was happening in Wuhan, when they realized that this pandemic was, and by the way, this would work for regardless if it was lab leak or not, when they realized that they had a big problem that they were going to have to show the world, it really starts to look as though they said to themselves, well, should this be a China problem or should this be a world problem? Because if it's a China problem, it's going to call, right, our mandate of heaven into question. It's going to call our dynastic power as the CCP, as the latest dynasty of China, into question as to whether or not we are the legitimate rulers, the legitimate heirs to power here in Beijing and Zhongnanhai. But if it becomes a world problem, and if it just becomes, one of those things, we live on this planet and we've been, fighting viruses as a human species for so long, then we can deflect blame away from ourselves. And in terms of, certainly the economic problems that arose because of the lockdowns and the economic issues, of course, that arose from just from the pandemic itself directly. And they said, why should we bear the brunt of these things? Why should China be the only country that has to be hit by this? Well, if it actually works in our favor, if we can then not necessarily prevent it or not do everything we can to prevent the spread from the rest of the world, but also find ways so that we can actually spin this to work in our favor by saying, look how good we dealt with this thing versus the way the rest of the world has dealt with this thing. And that has been the New York Times narrative. That is certainly the narrative in the 1% in the West today. That's the Charlie Munger narrative. He mentions it in that CNBC interview, right? He's saying exactly what Xi Jinping wants him to say, whether he knows it or not, by the way, right? He is playing off the exact same sheet of music that they're playing off of in Beijing. And so, you really do have to wonder what some of those strategic conversations that were being had at the highest levels were and why they made the decisions that they made, going back to the timeline we're looking at, which doesn't seem to be making much sense if their real goal was just shutting down a worldwide pandemic.
It was interesting because in early February, I remember seeing Chinese state-run media coming up with the spin that was basically China is saving the rest of the world by keeping the virus contained inside China. And this is before the US got a lot of cases, or I think Italy had already been hit, but generally it wasn't that bad where it had spread to a lot of countries. And their propaganda line at the time was, we're nobly sacrificing ourselves for the betterment of the world.
Yeah, I remember that. I wonder if those articles are still online.
Right. So you can see how sort of the early propaganda lines, the early responses to this thing don't line up with what was actually going on at the time. And, for myself, looking at it in terms of just the air travel, right, I said, well, you haven't stopped any flights at all. And you could look into the data and you would see flights going from China, from all sorts of cities in China, on those international airports. They never stopped. They never once stopped until other countries banned them and other countries put on these travel restrictions. It was not something that was led by the PRC ever.
One of the things you mentioned earlier in the podcast is about the Chinese Communist Party's historical narrative and the rewriting of history. And so what it seems like the Chinese regime is trying to do now is rewrite the history of COVID-19. And we'll see it for a few more years, probably a few further changes to the narrative. And then they will sort of look back on it as, whatever their new narrative becomes. Obviously, it will be something that's not their fault. And they're going to push this new revised historical narrative on everybody else to try to prevent a kind of true reflection or prevent scientists and journalists from ever really having the full picture of what happened.
Oh, you see this already early on, where when I'm talking about Shizhong Li and Dr. Daniel Anderson or Peter Daszak or any of these people who are associated with the Wuhan Institute, they say, well, we caused this. We were the ones who are saving the world. We were saving all of humanity. That's why we did all these experiments. That's why we're conducting it. And you can go back, by the way, and look at the rationale for why are we conducting gain of function. Dr. Fauci himself has a quote talking about this, saying, well, the benefit outweighs the risk because we will then get the next jump. We will be ahead of the next pandemic. We are the ones who will be in charge, who will have the playbook on the shelf to be ready when the next pandemic hits. The pandemic hit, guys, and I don't remember the Wuhan Institute or the NIH or Peter Daszak or Daniel Anderson or any of these people stepping forward and say, hey, we've seen something like this before. We've seen this in the lab. Here's a treatment for it. Here's how to help. Here's how it affected humanized mice, right? You never once saw anyone talking about this stuff or admitting that all of this was going on until we were going through their documents that they tried to hide and brought up all of these questions. We wouldn't even know that they were conducting these experiments because they themselves were not forthcoming about it in the early days of it. So they've been trying to puff themselves up and paint them as the saviors of humanity and the defenders of the human race against this vile virus. And that's the way Xi Jinping is positioning himself. That's the way you're now seeing Chinese academics position the party. There was this professor from Fudan University who gave a speech back in April, talking about this. He's saying, well, you have to look at U.S. decline and all the way from 9/11 to the financial crisis to the coronavirus crisis. The U.S. has just been taken down and taken down and taken down. And suddenly, and it's very sad. But of course, China is now able here to, we don't want to be number one. We would hate to have to do that. We don't want to knock the U.S. down, but it seems that the U.S. is declining all by itself. And so China must now assume the mantle, assume this role of the global hegemon, assume this role of protecting international trade, protecting international affairs. We don't want to, by the way. We just have to because of the vacuum that's left by the United States. So you're already starting to see this narrative be formed. And the CCP are masters of information warfare, narrative warfare. They're the absolute progenitors. Chairman Mao was a master of this. Their propagandists are key. I mean, you can't even talk about the Great Leap Forward. It's just the 3 years of natural disasters, right? Every textbook and every history book in China, it's 3 years of natural disasters. It's very bad. 3 years of natural disasters over and over and over. They're repeating these mantras that, and again, because of censorship, and we've seen the rise of censorship, I don't even think you need to say it, right? Social media companies censor in the West the exact same way that they were taught to censor by the Chinese government. Right? It's the exact same thing. Any narrative that doesn't comport, any piece of information that doesn't fit with whatever the affirmed story is, that's censored, that's wiped out, that's taken down.
Well, so we're almost about out of time, but I think to wrap this up, there's a very important theme that's been kind of running throughout this podcast, the idea of how the 1% in the West sort of works with the Chinese Communist Party. After the coronavirus, we have seen globally a huge downshift in public opinion about the Chinese Communist Party. It seems like most of the people of countries around the world are increasingly cynical about the Chinese Communist Party. What can they do to shift the power away from this sort of 1% that still wants to continue to engage with China, the BlackRocks of the world, still saying, now's the time to invest in Chinese bonds?
Look, that's where I say to people, like, this did not start overnight. It's not going to be unwound overnight, and there is no kind of magic bullet that gets you there. It is going to have to be a return, number one, to truth, to rationalism, and to understanding that you cannot go along with these globalized systems when you have bad actors like the CCP that are involved. And I want to be very clear that people need to understand it's not all of China, right? It's the 1% of China, the same way it's the 1% of the West, right? We're talking about the 1%, the 99% of China, the Lao Baixing, the people that I met when I was over there. They're good people. They're normal people. They want to live their lives. They want to have jobs. They want their kids to succeed. They want their kids to go to great schools. Just like everybody. They wake up, they go to work, right? They have commutes, they have whatever they have, just like everybody else everywhere on the planet. The difference is in terms of what's going on with our ruling elites and their ruling elites. And so for Americans, I would say this is why the ballot box is so important, but it's also why those economic decisions are so important, right? So understanding where your finances are going. If you have a 401k, if you have an IRA that's tied up in this stuff, you need to start looking at that. You need to start asking, is this what I want? Is this where I want my finances? If you are supporting somebody who's running for office, you really need to start digging in on these questions, right? You don't have to be a China superhawk or someone who's, completely anti-Wall Street and all this different stuff, to just have them start asking these basic questions of what's going on in terms of the U.S. overseas markets. Why are we allowing these different trade deals to go on? Why are we allowing these things to happen? And at the end of the day, the term made in America has to mean something again, not just this assembled in America crap, not just this, oh, I'm so sorry that, but part of it was thought of in America, but it was made somewhere else. No, make that mean something again, even if it means that something's going to, a product is going to cost a little bit more money, but it was able to help a guy in Detroit and all the net benefits that come of that throughout the United States in terms of bringing these manufacturing bases, and not even talk about manufacturing bases. Let's talk about the chip base, right? The fact that microprocessors and semiconductors are not made in the United States anymore. This is a national strategic emergency. It is an absolute crisis. Why do you think the PRC wants to take Taiwan back so much? Because they control 60% of the chip manufacturers in the entire world. And then you've got South Korea up with about another 15%. So boom, right there, 75% of microchips, processors, semiconductors that are being made in the world are right there. And believe me, the CCP absolutely understands that. This is a national strategic issue. Those are strategic assets. We need to start thinking in terms of what do we need as a country should something, God forbid, one of these military crises arise. And I'm not, by the way, someone who thinks that war is imminent with China. I certainly see the lines drawn. I certainly see the threat. I don't think it's necessarily imminent, only because they are trying, along with our 1%, to turn and if you look at this in terms of the millennials and Zoomers and people that are coming up, they want you to be a renter class. They want you to be consumers. They don't want you owning homes. They don't want you having stable jobs. They want you to be gig workers who are renting, living out of apartment buildings or living out of homes that you don't own, so you're not generating wealth, that you're just consuming products again and again. You're posting whatever they tell you. There's the latest fad on Instagram and social media, and you're changing your profile picture to include whatever the new thing is. They want you watching TikTok. You are their customer, and they want you in that mode. And they want to be the ones profiting off of you. They want you to be serfs. They want you to be peasants. And so Karl Marx, for many reasons, was wrong, but he was certainly wrong in terms of this, because it looks like history isn't a cycle of progress, that in this case, you've got a country that, like China, that went Marxist. You've got a country like America that went capitalist and freedom and embracing civil rights and human liberty. And now both of them are reverting back into what? A model of feudalism. This is neo-feudalism that we're seeing. And it's not like a Republican Democrat thing. That's the real force you have to fight against.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us today, Jack. For anyone watching who would like to follow you, or where should they go?
If you want more of this and certainly more of those investigations that we're breaking down, which are definitely going to happen on a daily basis in many cases. Some take longer than others, but humanevents.com is where I'm always up. On Twitter, it's at Jack Posobiec, JackPosobiec. And if you want the best night's sleep in the whole wide world, you can go to mypillow.com and use promo code POSO.
Well, thank you very much. We'll put a link to all of those below. And
right in.
Yeah. And do you want to plug a book?
Those pillows made in America, right in Minnesota. Yeah. As far as books, do have a new book out on Antifa. Believe it or not, it's a compendium of just all my last 5 years of investigation into Antifa, my experiences with them, infiltrating them, going into their meetings and going into their events and their public conflagrations like Chaz out there. You focus on the rise of communism in China and throughout the world, and you've got to focus on Antifa as a symptom of that. So that's up, antifabook.com, if people are interested in checking that one out.
And we'll have to get you on our other show, America Uncovered, to talk about that someday.
Absolutely.
Jack, it's been great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, guys.
Well, I got to say, after that interview, I'm feeling really hopeful.
Yeah, why?
It's because, no matter what differences we may have, different languages, culture, ideology, the 1% of each country will always find ways to work together.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Doesn't fill you with hope, Shelley?
No, hope's not the exact word I'd use.
Oh, what is the exact word?
Let's just move on.
Okay. And this podcast is sponsored by Daily Peanut. I know you like following the news, and Daily Peanut gives you interesting news stories to read every day. They're fast, timely, and entertaining. Just subscribe to their email newsletter. It's free, and you can read it on your phone, computer, or tablet. It's a great way to filter out the noise and learn more about the world news that matters. Join more than 250,000 other readers. Click the link in the description below to get Daily Peanut for free. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And we'll talk to you next time.